going to be focused on the concept of variables. And the reason that I wanted to spend some time looking just at this topic is because it's so important to the rest of the course. And so if you don't find that you're able to understand variables now in week 1, I'm worried that you're going to have a difficult time when we start looking at other aspects of research methods, when we start looking at analyzing data, when we're trying to read articles. I'm concerned that anyone who's still struggling with understanding variables will struggle again. So let's see if we can nail this down now. So what is a variable? Variables are concepts that you intend to examine or manipulate for observation purposes. This is essentially, what are you studying? So for example, Joe tells Maggie he's going to do a study about weight loss. Maggie asks, well, what are your variables going to be? And Joe says, I'm going to be examining the effectiveness of a program which is intended to help people lose weight. So he's going to look to see if this program works. So his variables are first the program, that's what he's looking at, but the result that he'll be looking at is each individual person's weight. So those are the two variables, the program and each person's weight. So let's look at some more examples just to make sure this is clear. So Carolina is measuring the mood of prisoners who have been incarcerated for a long time. Her variables are mood and long time incarceration. Now in a little bit we're going to talk about how you specify what these things mean, but for now let's just keep looking at examples of identifying variables. So Max is examining the patterns of food insecurity that exist as we age. His variables would be hunger and age. Another important way to look at these is defining what we call the independent variable versus the dependent variable. People seem to struggle with this even though it's actually quite simple, so let's not overthink it. Essentially, one variable you might be manipulating or changing, and the other variable will likely change as a result of that. So the independent variable is the one that you think may cause or lead to a variation in the other variable. And so we call the other variable dependent just because it's dependent on whatever happens to the independent variable. This is probably confusing right now, but it gets a lot more clear when we start to look at examples. So, if maybe your research question is, do video games lead to violence? The independent variable would be video game use, and we're asking, does that lead to violence? So violence is the dependent variable because it's dependent on whether someone is exposed to video games. So let's look at the second one. Maybe our question is, does gender influence the likelihood of receiving a diagnosis of anxiety? So here, the researcher is wondering, if you go to the doctor and you're maybe expressing some symptoms of anxiety, are you more likely to get a diagnosis if maybe you're a female versus a male? So does gender influence the likelihood of receiving a diagnosis of anxiety? Here, again, the independent variable is gender, and the dependent variable is diagnosis of anxiety. Because diagnosis of anxiety may be dependent on gender. Now, can you see how it wouldn't be flipped the other way around? We're not asking here, does having anxiety influence your gender, right? That doesn't even make sense. It doesn't make sense to ask whether a person has anxiety or not, does that make them more or less male or female? So that's why in this case we can see we clearly are asking, does gender influence anxiety? Now for the first one, maybe we could flip it. Maybe we might ask, does someone's maybe being predisposed to violent behavior, does that make them more or less likely to play video games? Now if we were asking that question, then the independent variable and dependent variable would be flipped. If we were asking, does violence lead to video games, then violence would be the independent variable and video games would be the dependent variable. The last one says, does greater diversity in a workplace translate to better business outcomes? So here, maybe if we were doing the study, we'd be looking at the diverse makeup of a workplace and then looking to see how good is this business doing. And maybe we're wondering if having more diversity leads to better business. And so just by the way I said that, greater diversity leads to better business, we can see that greater diversity is the independent variable, and then the result would be, or the result we're looking at would be business outcomes, so we would call that the dependent variable. Finally, here I want to talk about operationalizing variables. I alluded to this a few slides ago when I'm trying to think of what the example was already. Oh, it was someone was measuring mood of folks who have been incarcerated for what we at the time just called a long time. Well, you might say, well, what constitutes a long time? Is 2 days a long time to be incarcerated? Is 2 months a long time to be incarcerated? Is 20 years a long time to be incarcerated? So that brings up the topic of operationalizing variables. When we operationalize a variable, we define exactly how it's going to be measured. So let's go back to our video games and violence example. If you're conducting a study to see if video games lead to violent behavior, you need to clearly define those variables. So how do you decide what counts as a video game? What qualifies as a video game? So if you're playing a game on your cell phone, does that count as a video game? If you're playing a board game that has a video component, does that count as a video game? And if you're doing a study, you really need to carefully define what you're considering a video game to be. You would also need to operationalize your dependent variable, which in this case is violence. So must the violence be physical? Does just one violent act count as violent behavior? Or are we saying, we're thinking someone is displaying violence if they show 3 or more violent acts? So again, we're just honing in here. You have to really carefully define. I have some more examples. So maybe the question is, do intelligent people make more money? And maybe in our case, we decide we are going to operationalize intelligence as the achievement of a score of 500 or higher on the Johnson Intelligence Test. And by the way, I just made up the name Johnson Intelligence Test just for the sake of demonstration. So if you haven't heard of it, that's why. But that's how, in this imaginary study, we are going to operationalize intelligence. And I should pause here and say, you may have noticed I said, in this case, we've decided to operationalize intelligence this way. Depending on how you design your study, each researcher really gets to define these things themselves. And that's all part of how we critique research in the end when it gets published. You might look at a published article and say, well, you know what? I don't really like the way they operationalized these variables. The operationalization does not make sense. Let's just finish this one here, though, because we also need to operationalize money. So does it, are we going to operationalize it as how much money is in your bank account? How much money is in your wallet? Well, in this case, we've decided for this study, money is going to be measured based on the subject's most recently filed tax return. And again, to finish the thought on the example of mood and long-term incarceration, maybe we measure mood on some sort of depression scale, and we decide what particular score or cutoff will count as low mood or high mood. And then long-term incarceration, maybe we qualify that as greater than 1 year. So these are just some examples. So just to recap where we've been, we defined variables, what they are, and then we broke down the difference between independent and dependent variables, and finally we finished up with talking about how to really carefully measure these by operationalizing them. I'm hoping this created some clarity for you. because, as I said at the beginning, as we move forward, it's crucial that you understand these concepts. So as we're talking about articles, as we're completing assignments, this kind of language around variables, independent, dependent, and operationalizing must become common language for you. And if weeks down the road you're still sort of trying to grasp them, I'm worried that you'll have a difficult time moving forward with the class. So even now, after this 10-minute recorded lecture, you're struggling a little bit, I recommend that you go back and read the chapters, that you really carefully review the material, because these are really foundational concepts that will take you further in the course.